The rain comes to Petra differently than it comes to other places. It doesn't simply fall from the sky. It gathers in the narrow throat of the sick, that mile-long corridor of stone carved by ancient floods, and it whispers. The water finds every crack, every crevice in the rose-red sandstone. And as it flows, it carries sounds that shouldn't exist. Sounds that echo from somewhere deep in the earth, or perhaps from somewhere else entirely. This is what Ahmed al-Salamin heard on a night in October 2017. He had worked as a night security guard at Petra for 11 years, walking the same paths that 2 million tourists traverse each year during daylight hours. But Ahmed knew a different Petra. The Petra that emerges after the last tour bus rumbles away, after the vendor stalls close, after the floodlights dim and the ancient city returns to the darkness it knew for centuries. That night, the rain began just after midnight. Ahmed was making his rounds near the Treasury, that magnificent facade carved into the cliff face that has become the symbol of Petra itself. The rain intensified quickly, as it often does in the desert, turning from a whisper to a roar in minutes. And then Ahmed heard the voices. At first, he thought it was other guards, perhaps trapped by the sudden downpour. But as he moved closer to the Treasury, sheltering under the narrow overhang of stone, he realized the voices were coming from inside the carved monument itself. The language was nothing he recognized, and Ahmed spoke 4 languages fluently. The cadence was wrong, the sounds too guttural, too ancient. According to his testimony given to the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, the voices seemed to be chanting, rising and falling with the rhythm of the rain. Ahmed is not alone in what he heard. By day, Petra is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the new 7 wonders of the world. A place where archaeologists and historians work to unlock the secrets of the Nabatean people who carved this city from living rock over 2,000 years ago. But when the sun sets and the tourists leave, something else claims dominion over these ancient stones. The Bedouin tribes who have lived in and around Petra for generations have always known this. The Bedouin tribe, who were relocated from the caves of Petra in the 1980s, speak of the Djinn that inhabit the city. These are not the genies of Western fantasy, but beings of smokeless fire mentioned in the Quran, creatures that exist in a realm parallel to our own. The Bedouins say the Djinn have always been in Petra, drawn to places of power, to the thin spaces where the veil between worlds grows gossamer thin. But it's not just the Bedouin who report these encounters. Sarah Mitchell, a British archaeologist who worked on excavations in the Royal Tombs area in 2012, documented her own experience in her field notes. She had stayed late one evening, sketching pottery fragments by lamplight. When the rain began, she heard what she described as singing coming from deeper in the tomb complex. She followed the sound, drawn by academic curiosity, until she reached a chamber where no light from her lamp seemed to penetrate the darkness. The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, she felt what she called a profound sense of being watched by something vast and utterly indifferent to her existence. Modern visitors report similar phenomena. Online travel forums contain dozens of accounts from tourists who extended their visits past closing time, or who stayed in nearby hotels and ventured back into the site after dark. Many describe the same elements: the sound of voices in unknown languages, the sensation of being followed through the sick, and most disturbingly, glimpses of figures that seem to materialize from the stone itself when the rain falls. The rain appears to be a catalyst, though no one knows why. Perhaps it's the way water interacts with the ancient rock, creating acoustic effects that sound like voices. Perhaps it's the way rainstorms in the desert arrive with such sudden violence that they alter the very atmosphere, charging the air with electricity and possibility. Or perhaps the rain awakens something that sleeps in the dry months, something that has dwelt in Petra since long before the Nabateans came, since before humans carved the first stone. The most chilling accounts come from the Treasury area, that iconic facade that served as the final resting place of a Nabatean king. Local police records, though incomplete and often dismissed, contain at least 5 reports of missing persons last seen near the Treasury during rainstorms over the past 15 years. 3 were tourists who had wandered away from their groups. 2 were guides who knew the site intimately. None were ever found, despite extensive searches that included the use of trained dogs, thermal imaging, and experienced Bedouin trackers who know every hidden canyon and cave. The official explanation is always the same: flash floods are common and deadly in Petra's narrow canyons. The water can rise 15 feet in minutes, turning passages into raging torrents that sweep away everything in their path. Bodies could be carried miles away, buried under tons of debris, lost forever in the labyrinthine waters that surround the ancient city. This explanation is reasonable, rational, and fits the known facts. But it doesn't explain why witnesses report seeing the missing persons walking willingly into the darkness, following voices that call to them in languages they shouldn't understand. It doesn't explain the strange symbol found carved into the wall near where one tourist was last seen, a symbol that matched no known Nabatean script. It doesn't explain why search dogs would track a scent to the solid rock face of the Treasury, and then refuse to go further, whining and pulling away as if confronting something invisible and terrible. Ahmed Al-Salami no longer works night shifts at Petra. After that October night in 2017, he requested a transfer to day duties only. When pressed for details beyond his official report, he will say only this: the voices he heard were old, older than the stones themselves, and they were calling something by name. He won't say what name they called, or how he knew it was a name at all. But sometimes, he says, on rainy nights when he's home with his family, he can still hear those voices carried on the wind, and he wonders if whatever they were calling finally answered. So we are left with questions that have no comfortable answers. What walks the corridors of Petra after the tourists leave? What speaks in dead languages when the rain falls? What watches from the shadows of the Treasury, patient and eternal, waiting for the right conditions, the right moment, the right offering? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what awakens in Petra when the rain falls, and what does it hunger for? The rock face bleeds at sunset. This is what the Bedouin tribes have whispered for generations about Petra, the rose-red city carved into the sandstone cliffs of southern Jordan. But the blood they speak of is not metaphorical. It is the deep crimson that seeps through the porous stone when the dying light strikes at precisely the right angle, as if the mountains themselves remember the ancient rituals performed in their shadow. Long before Petra became known to the world as an architectural wonder, long before archaeologists classified it as a trading hub or a cultural crossroads, it was something far more primal. Between 400 BCE and 106 CE, the Nabatean people carved an entire necropolis into these cliffs. Not a city for the living, but a monumental tomb complex designed to house the dead for eternity. Every facade, every column, every ornate doorway led not to homes or markets, but to burial chambers hollowed deep within the living rock. The scale of this death-obsessed civilization staggers the mind. Over 800 individual tomb structures have been identified, but scholars estimate that hundreds more remain hidden within the sandstone, their entrances collapsed or deliberately sealed. The Nabateans spent centuries carving these monuments, dedicating their finest craftsmanship not to palaces or temples for worship, but to the architecture of the afterlife. The Treasury, the most photographed structure in Petra, with its elaborate Hellenistic facade standing 40 meters tall, is not a treasury at all. It is a royal tomb, its name a mistranslation that has persisted for centuries, masking its true purpose as a gateway between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. But the Nabateans themselves claimed they were not the first to inhabit these cliffs. According to traditions that predate Islam, but survived within it, the Jinn were here first. These entities, described in pre-Islamic Arabian lore as beings created from smokeless fire, made their homes in desolate places far from human habitation. The twisted canyons and towering rock formations of Petra, isolated in the desert wilderness, provided perfect sanctuary for these creatures of the unseen world. The Jinn of Arabian mythology are not the wish-granting genies of Western fantasy. They are far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous. Islamic scripture acknowledges their existence as a separate creation, beings with intelligence and free will who share the earth with humanity but remain largely invisible to human eyes. They can be righteous or wicked, peaceful or violent, but they are always other, always alien to human understanding. And according to the folklore that clings to Petra like morning mist in the Sikh Canyon, they were territorial. The legends passed down through generations of Bedouin storytellers speak of a terrible bargain. When the Nabateans first arrived in these mountains, sometime around the 4th century BCE, they found the rock faces already marked with strange symbols, weathered by time, but clearly not natural formation. The cliffs echoed with sounds that had no source. Travelers reported seeing lights moving through the canyons at night, dancing flames that left no char marks on the stone. The few who attempted to establish camps in the area spoke of vivid nightmares and waking visions of figures carved from shadow and ember. The Nabatean priest kings, according to these accounts, did not flee. Instead, they sought communion with the Djinn through blood ritual. On moonless nights, they would slaughter animals at the base of the cliffs, letting the blood soak into the porous sandstone. They chanted in languages that their own people could not understand, words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. And they made their offer: alliance instead of war, coexistence instead of conquest. The Djinn would be honored, fed with sacrifice and reverence, given the deepest chambers within the rock where human feet would never tread. In exchange, the Nabateans asked for something impossible: the knowledge and power to carve architecture that defied human capability. Consider the engineering required to create Petra's monuments. The facades are not built but carved downward from the top of the cliffs, requiring master craftsmen to somehow suspend themselves while removing tons of rock with bronze tools. The precision is extraordinary. Measurements are exact, symmetries are perfect, and the architectural details rival anything produced in Greece or Rome during the same period. How did a nomadic people, known primarily as traders and desert wanderers, suddenly develop these capabilities? The archaeological record shows no gradual evolution of technique, no practice structures or failed attempts. The earliest tombs are already masterworks. Modern engineers examining the site have noted anomalies that challenge conventional explanations. Some of the internal chambers extend far deeper into the mountain than should be structurally sound. Yet, they have stood for over 2,000 years. The acoustics of certain spaces cannot be explained by the geometry alone. Sounds behave in ways that seem designed rather than accidental. And there are the sealed chambers, dozens of them, blocked not from the outside but from within, as if something was meant to be kept inside rather than kept out. The pact, if it existed, came with conditions that the Nabateans observed with religious fervor. Certain tombs were never to be opened, even by those who carved them. Specific chambers required regular offerings of blood, incense, and precious oils. And above all, the deepest parts of the complex, the passages that wound furthest into the mountain's heart, were forbidden to all but a select few priest kings, who underwent rituals of purification that could last for weeks. But empires fall, and forgotten vows lose their power. When Rome annexed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 CE, the new rulers had no knowledge of these ancient agreements, and no respect for the old traditions. Roman administrators converted some of the tombs to secular use, stored grain in sacred chambers, and allowed soldiers to camp in spaces that had been consecrated to the Djinn. According to local legend, this desecration triggered consequences that would echo through centuries. The city began to empty, not through conquest or forced migration, but through a gradual exodus driven by unnamed fears. Families would wake to find their homes filled with sand, despite sealed doors and windows. Children reported seeing tall figures made of smoke standing in doorways at dusk. The sound of breathing emanated from the sealed tombs, loud enough to wake entire neighborhoods. Wells that had provided fresh water for generations suddenly ran dry or turned bitter, and people began disappearing, not in ones or twos but in groups, vanishing during the night with no signs of struggle or flight. By the 4th century CE, Petra was largely abandoned. A massive earthquake in 363 CE provided convenient explanation for the desertion, but the Bedouin tribes who witnessed the city's final days told a different story. They spoke of the night the tombs opened, not the doors, but the rock itself, splitting like flesh to release things that had been imprisoned within. They described a sound like thousands of voices screaming in unison, a noise so terrible that it could be heard for miles across the desert. And they swore that those who remained in Petra after that night were never seen again. Those shadows in human shapes could sometimes be glimpsed moving through the ruins. For over 1,000 years, Petra remained lost to the Western world, hidden not merely by desert sands, but by the absolute refusal of local tribes to approach it. The Bedouin called it Wadi Musa, the Valley of Moses, connecting it to the prophet who struck water from stone. But they had other names for it as well. Al-Madina al-Hamra, the Red City for the color of blood. Bait al-Jinn, the House of Jinn. And most tellingly, Al-Madina alati yamshi fiha al-amwat, the city where the dead still walk. These were not mere superstitions to be dismissed by the rationalism of outsiders. The tribes had practical reasons for their avoidance. Those who ventured into the ruins seeking shelter or treasure reported experiences that drove some to madness. The Seek, the narrow canyon that serves as the main entrance to Petra, became particularly notorious. This natural gorge, stretching for over a kilometer with walls rising 200 meters on either side, creates acoustic effects that science can partially explain. Sounds echo and distort, bouncing off the smooth rock faces in patterns that can make a single voice sound like many, can make distant noises seem near and near. Sounds seem to emanate from within the stone itself. But the Bedouin insisted the voices in the Seek were not echoes. They were conversations, arguments, lamentations in languages no living person spoke. Travelers claimed to hear their names called from the shadows, spoken in the voices of dead relatives. Some reported music, drums and pipes playing melodies that predated any known Arabian tradition. And there were the whispers, constant and inescapable, that seemed to come from the rock itself, speaking directly into the minds of those who walked the canyon. When Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt rediscovered Petra for the Western world in 1812, he had to disguise himself as an Arab Muslim pilgrim to convince a local guide to take him through the Seek. Even then, the guide refused to remain after sunset, and Burckhardt's journal records strange details that later academic accounts omitted. He wrote of feeling constantly watched, of glimpsing movement in his peripheral vision that vanished when he turned to look directly. He described a pervasive sense of trespass, as if he had entered a place where human presence was not merely unwelcome, but fundamentally wrong. Subsequent archaeologists and tourists have reported similar experiences with remarkable consistency. Visitors to certain tombs describe sudden temperature drops of 20 degrees or more with no apparent cause. Photographs taken in specific locations often show anomalies, streaks of light or shadow that were not visible to the naked eye. And the sounds persist, heard by skeptics and believers alike. Footsteps in empty chambers, breathing in sealed tombs, and always, endlessly, the whispers in the sick. The Islamic tradition holds that jinn are neither angels nor demons, but a third category of sentient being, created before humans from the fire of a scorching wind. They live in a world parallel to ours, occasionally intersecting with human reality, in places where the barrier grows thin. Desert ruins, ancient tombs, and abandoned cities are traditional dwelling places for these entities. Petra, simultaneously all three, would be the perfect nexus. Perhaps the Nabateans understood something we have forgotten. Perhaps they knew that certain places belong to forces older than humanity, and that building there requires negotiation rather than conquest. Perhaps their blood pacts were not superstition, but a sophisticated understanding of realities we no longer perceive. Or perhaps the dead of Petra, entombed in such overwhelming numbers within the living rock, created their own presence, an accumulated weight of mortality that lingers in the stone. The city remains, rose-red and magnificent, receiving thousands of visitors each year. But the Bedouin guides still refuse certain requests. There are chambers they will not enter, passages they will not explore, and questions they will not answer. And when the sun sets and the tourists depart, when the shadows grow long in the sick and the desert wind begins to move through the carved facades, those who listen closely can still hear the whispers. The city where the dead still walk keeps its secrets, carved deep in stone and sealed with ancient blood. The desert wind carries stories that pass from one generation to the next, whispered around campfires, and spoken with reverence in the black goat hair tents that have sheltered Bedouin families for countless years. Near the rose-red city of Petra, where ancient tombs stand carved into towering sandstone cliffs, three families guard knowledge that outsiders rarely hear. These are not tales meant for tourists who arrive in air-conditioned buses, cameras ready to capture Instagram moments. These are warnings, passed down through bloodlines, etched into memory through encounters that defy easy explanation. Mohammed Abdul sits cross-legged on a worn carpet outside his home, which rests within sight of Petra's weathered facades. His face carries the deep lines of 73 years spent under the Jordanian sun, and his hands move expressively as he speaks, punctuating each word with gestures that his father taught him and his grandfather before that. When he talks about the jinn, his voice drops to a tone that commands attention, the same tone elders use when discussing matters of life and death. The story he tells most often belongs to his grandfather, a man named Suleiman, who lived through the transformation of Petra from a hidden Bedouin secret to an archaeological wonder visited by people from every corner of the world. In 1952, during one of those rare winter storms that turned the desert into something wild and electric, Suleiman was leading 3 goats back toward camp as darkness fell. The rain came suddenly, as it always does in this part of Jordan, transforming dry waters into rushing torrents within minutes. Thunder cracked across the sky like the world was splitting open, and lightning illuminated the Treasury facade in brilliant white flashes. According to Mohammed, his grandfather was running for shelter, his headscarf soaked through, his sandals slipping on wet stone, when he saw something that made him stop dead, despite the storm raging around him. The Treasury, that magnificent structure carved by Nabatean hands more than 2,000 years ago, seemed to pulse with its own light between the lightning strikes. And then, from the dark recess of the entrance, something emerged. Suleiman described it as a shadow that moved against the natural flow of shadows, a darkness that seemed to absorb the lightning rather than be illuminated by it. The figure rose upward, growing taller than any man, taller than the columns that framed the Treasury's entrance. Mohammed leans forward when he reaches this part of the story, making sure his listeners understand the crucial detail. The eyes. His grandfather swore until his dying day that he saw eyes like burning coals, red and orange and yellow all at once, fixed on him with an intelligence that was decidedly not human. Suleiman did what any Bedouin would do when confronted by a jinn. He recited protective verses, words from the Quran that his own father had taught him for exactly such moments. He did not run, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. Running from jinn, the elders say, only encourages them to chase. Instead, he backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact with those burning eyes, continuing his recitation until he reached a safe distance. The figure watched him go, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it withdrew back into the Treasury's darkness. The rain stopped moments later, as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of water dripping from ancient stones and Suleiman's own ragged breathing. But Mohammed's family is not alone in their knowledge. 20 minutes walk from Mohammed's home, in a settlement that clusters near the ancient Roman street of Petra, lives Fatima al-Nawafle. She is 68 years old, a grandmother who still weaves traditional patterns into wool rugs, using techniques unchanged for centuries. Her family's encounter came a generation later, in 1979, during the month of February, when winter rains briefly turned the desert green. Fatima's uncle, a man named Hassan, worked as a guide even then, showing the first waves of tourists through Petra's wonders. He knew every tomb, every carved facade, every hidden pathway through the mountains. On the evening in question, he had stayed late to retrieve a water canteen he had left near the high place of sacrifice. The sky had been clear when he began his ascent, but desert weather is treacherous and changeable. By the time he reached the ancient ritual platform high above the city, clouds had rolled in like a dark tide, and rain began to fall in heavy drops that felt like small stones hitting his shoulders. Hassan took shelter beneath an overhang, watching as the storm intensified. Lightning struck somewhere close enough that he smelled ozone and felt his hair stand on end. In that moment of illumination, he saw 3 figures standing at the edge of the high place, looking down toward the valley below. They were tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for their bodies, proportions that his mind struggled to process. They did not move like humans move. There was something fluid about them, something that reminded him of smoke rising from a fire, constantly shifting yet maintaining form. Hassan did what his family had always taught him. He remained absolutely still. He controlled his breathing. He did not call out or make himself known. The jinn, according to Bedouin understanding, are aware of humans but do not always choose to interact. Drawing attention is dangerous. So Hassan watched as the three figures stood silhouetted against the storm, and he waited. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the figures simply dissipated, breaking apart like morning mist touched by sun. The storm passed. Hassan climbed down the ancient steps with trembling legs and never returned to the high place after dark again. The third family lives in the modern village of Wadi Musa, but their roots in this landscape go back as far as any. Khalid al-Azazmeh, now in his 50s, speaks of an encounter his mother witnessed in 1988. She had been collecting herbs that grow only in certain microclimates within Petra's canyons, plants used for traditional medicines. The day had been hot and clear, giving no warning of the weather that would develop. But as afternoon turned to evening, she noticed clouds building with unusual speed, piling up against the mountains in dark masses that seemed to vibrate with contained energy. She was near the street of facades, that long row of tomb entrances carved into the cliff face, when the rain began. With it came thunder so loud she felt it in her chest, and lightning that turned the sandstone walls electric pink. She ran toward the nearest tomb entrance, intending only to wait out the storm in the outer chamber. The Bedouin never sleep inside these tombs, never make camp in their depths, but sheltering briefly in the outer areas during emergencies is sometimes necessary. As she stood just inside the entrance, water streaming down the carved facade behind her, she heard a sound from deeper within the tomb. It was not wind, though wind does create strange sounds in these carved spaces. It was not an animal, though animals do sometimes shelter in the tombs. It was a voice, or something like a voice, speaking in a language she did not recognize. The words, if they were words, seemed to resonate in a frequency that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. Khalid's mother did what generations of Bedouin women had done before her. She reached into her robe and pulled out a small leather pouch that hung on a cord around her neck. Inside was paper inscribed with protective verses, folded carefully and sealed with wax. She held this talisman before her and stepped backward out of the tomb, back into the rain. She would rather face the storm's natural fury than whatever spoke from the darkness inside the ancient burial chamber. She made it back to her family's camp, soaked to the bone but unharmed. She never collected herbs near the street of facades again. These three accounts, separated by decades but united in their essential nature, reflect a pattern that Bedouin families have documented through oral tradition. The Djinn of Petra, whatever their nature, appear most frequently during the brief desert rains between November and March. This is when the desert transforms, when water brings temporary life to a landscape defined by absence. The Bedouin understand this connection. Water is life in the desert, but it is also chaos, a force that breaks the ordinary rules. And when the ordinary rules break down, other things can break through. The traditions that protect against Djinn encounters are practiced with the same seriousness as any other survival skill in the desert. Never sleep inside the tombs, only in the open air or in tents. If you must enter Petra at night, carry protective verses written by someone known for piety. Recite specific prayers before passing through the Sikh, that narrow gorge that serves as the main entrance to the ancient city. Do not answer if you hear your name called from a source you cannot see. Do not follow lights that appear where no lights should be. These are not superstitions to be dismissed, the families explain. These are protocols developed over generations of living alongside mysteries that have no place in modern rational thought. Muhammad, sitting outside his home with the afternoon sun beginning its descent, offers one final observation that carries the weight of genuine concern. The Djinn are becoming more active in recent years, he says. More people report strange encounters. More tourists describe inexplicable experiences. More nights feature sounds and lights that the old explanations do not quite cover. Muhammad attributes this to several factors. Petra hosts over 500,000 visitors each year now, he notes, disturbing places that once saw human presence only rarely. Archaeological work continues to excavate and expose new areas, opening chambers that have been sealed for centuries. The natural order is being disrupted. But there is something else in Muhammad's voice when he speaks of recent years, something that suggests he has his own fresh experiences he does not quite want to detail. He looks toward the Treasury, visible in the distance as a dark shape against the fading light, and he says only that the old protections are more important now than ever. His children, who have smartphones and internet access and modern educations, still carry protective verses when they walk through Petra at night, still observe the prohibition against sleeping in the tombs, still know the stories of Suleiman and Hassan and Khalid's mother. Knowledge passes from generation to generation, not because it is quaint or traditional, but because it serves a purpose. And in the desert, where modern infrastructure remains thin and ancient places still hold power, that knowledge might be the difference between a safe return home and something else entirely. In the spring of 2014, Dr. Helena Weiss arrived at Petra with impeccable credentials and a reputation for methodical precision that had earned her respect throughout European academic circles. The 43-year-old archaeologist from the University of Heidelberg had spent nearly 2 decades studying Nabatean culture, publishing extensively on ancient trade routes and funerary practices. Her colleagues described her as meticulous to the point of obsession, someone who documented everything, cross-referenced every detail, and never allowed emotion to cloud her academic judgment. That reputation makes what happened over the next 3 years all the more disturbing, because the woman who vanished in March 2017 bore almost no resemblance to the scholar who first set foot in those rose-red ruins. The excavation project Helena led focused on unexplored areas around the royal tombs, particularly chambers that previous teams had dismissed as structurally unstable or archaeologically insignificant. Her initial reports read exactly as one would expect from a veteran researcher: detailed stratigraphic analysis, careful cataloging of pottery fragments, measured speculation about ritual usage based on comparable sites. Her field team of 6 researchers worked under her direction without incident for the first 8 months, making modest but legitimate discoveries that added to the understanding of Nabatean burial customs. The shift began in December of 2014, during Petra's rainy season. Desert rainstorms in southern Jordan can be violent and sudden, transforming dry waters into raging torrents within minutes. Most researchers evacuate the site when storms approach, taking shelter in the modern town of Wadi Musa. Helena, however, began insisting on remaining at the excavation site during these events, initially claiming she wanted to document how water flow patterns might reveal ancient drainage systems. Her assistants thought this dedication admirable, if somewhat extreme. They did not yet know she had purchased electronic voice phenomenon recording equipment and had begun conducting sessions inside the tombs after her team departed for the evening. EVP research occupies a controversial space between parapsychology and pseudoscience. Practitioners claim that electronic devices can capture voices of the dead or other entities, sounds imperceptible to human ears that emerge only upon playback. Mainstream science dismisses these supposed voices as pareidolia, the human tendency to find patterns in random noise, or as simple radio interference. Helena had never shown interest in such fringe pursuits before. Her academic work dealt strictly with empirical evidence, physical artifacts, and peer-reviewed methodology. Yet entries in her field journal from late December 2014 reveal a sudden immersion in EVP theory and technique. Recorded for 3 hours during last night's storm, she wrote on December 28, "Playback reveals distinct phonetic structures at 17 minutes, 42 seconds. Not Arabic. Not Aramaic. Possibly Nabatean, but pronunciation, unlike any academic reconstruction. Sound appears to respond to questions. Requires further investigation with improved equipment." Her research assistant, Marcus Chen, later reported that Helena became increasingly secretive about her nocturnal activity. She would dismiss the team early, claiming she needed solitude to process data and update project logs. In reality, she was spending entire nights in the royal tombs with her recording devices, waiting for storms, documenting what she believed were communications with entities she referred to in her private notes as the Guardians. By February of 2015, her journal entries had taken on a tone that colleagues would later describe as troubling. "They speak more clearly during rain," she wrote. "Water conducts something beyond electricity. The Nabateans knew. That is why they carved channels into the rock, not merely for practical purposes, but to create resonance chambers. The tombs are not tombs. They are interfaces. The tall one appeared again tonight near the urn tomb. He does not speak on the recordings, but his presence clarifies the others' voices. He wants me to understand something about the Western Chambers. No one on her team had seen any figure, tall or otherwise. When Helena began referencing this entity in casual conversation, describing his flowing robes and the way he stood motionless in the carved facades, her colleagues exchanged worried glances. She seemed unaware that her descriptions were concerning. She spoke of this figure with the same academic detachment she once reserved for pottery classifications, as though documenting an observable phenomenon that everyone should acknowledge as real. The term djinn entered her vocabulary in spring of 2015. She had been consulting with local Bedouin families whose ancestors had lived around Petra for generations, ostensibly gathering oral histories about the site. These conversations introduced her to traditional beliefs about jinn, supernatural beings in Islamic theology and Arabian folklore that exist in a realm adjacent to human reality. Some Bedouin considered the ancient tombs dwelling places for such entities, locations to avoid after dark. Helena became convinced that what Western academics dismissed as superstition represented genuine knowledge passed down through centuries. The Bedouin are not primitive, she wrote in April 2015. They are custodians of experiential data that academia ignores. The jinn are not metaphor. They are intelligences that exist in geological formations, particularly in carved stone where human intention has shaped the rock. Petra is not simply an archaeological site. It is an active location where these entities maintain presence. The recordings prove this. The tall one has shown me where to look. There are chambers beneath the palace tomb that have never been documented. Her team grew alarmed when Helena began conducting unauthorized solo explorations based on what she claimed were revelations from her dream encounters with a robed figure. She would arrive at the morning briefing with detailed sketches of supposed hidden passages, insisting they excavate specific areas that ground-penetrating radar had shown no evidence of voids or chambers. When her assistants questioned the basis for these new directions, she became defensive, accusing them of closed-mindedness and suggesting they lacked the sensitivity to perceive what she could perceive. Marcus Chen attempted to contact Helena's department supervisor at Heidelberg in June of 2015, expressing concern about her mental state and the project's deteriorating scientific rigor. The university administration responded with bureaucratic slowness, requesting documentation and formal assessment. Meanwhile, Helena's nighttime vigils intensified. She had upgraded to military-grade audio recording equipment, devices capable of capturing frequencies beyond normal human hearing range. Her tent, erected at the high place of sacrifice, became a makeshift laboratory filled with playback equipment, notebooks covered in transcriptions of supposed voices, and sketches of the tall figure that appeared with increasing frequency in her accounts. The drawings are particularly unsettling. Unlike her precise archaeological illustrations, these sketches show a crude, almost childlike rendering of an elongated human form. The figure has no facial features in most versions, just a blank oval where the face should be. The robes flow unnaturally in her drawings, sometimes appearing to merge with the rock formations behind the figure. In one sketch dated September 2016, she had written beside the image, "He is not other. He is Petra itself, the consciousness of carved stone." The Nabateans did not build tombs for the dead. They built bodies for the guardians to inhabit. By late 2016, only 2 members of her original team remained. The others had requested transfers or resigned entirely, uncomfortable with Helena's transformation and unwilling to participate in what had become less archaeological excavation and more occult investigation. The university finally took action in January of 2017, sending a senior faculty member to assess the situation. That assessor, Dr. Friedrich Vogel, spent 4 days at the site and filed a report recommending Helena's immediate removal and psychiatric evaluation. He described her living conditions as degraded, her record-keeping as unscientific and delusional, and her behavior as consistent with severe psychological breakdown. Helena refused to leave voluntarily. She insisted she was on the verge of a discovery that would revolutionize understanding of Nabatean culture and human interaction with non-physical entities. She claimed the tall figure had promised to reveal the greatest secret of Petra if she remained faithful to the work. When Dr. Vogel pressed her on what she meant by faithful, She reportedly smiled and said, "He requires dedication. He requires that I stop dividing myself between their world and his. He has been waiting for someone like me for a very long time." Wow. The university began formal proceedings to terminate her fieldwork, a process complicated by international academic protocols and Jordanian permit regulations. Those procedures were still underway when the final storm came in March of 2017. Weather services had not predicted the system that rolled over Petra on the evening of March 14. It arrived suddenly, a massive desert thunderstorm that sent tourists scrambling for buses and prompted site authorities to evacuate all personnel. Helena, predictably, stayed behind. Marcus Chen, who had remained out of loyalty and concern, tried to convince her to seek shelter in town. He later reported that she seemed almost euphoric, saying the unexpected nature of the storm proved it was orchestrated, that the guardians were calling her. She grabbed her recording equipment and headed toward the high place of sacrifice as the first drops began to fall. Marcus watched her climb the ancient carved steps until the intensifying rain obscured his view. That was the last confirmed sighting of Dr. Helena Weiss. The storm raged throughout the night with unusual ferocity. Lightning struck multiple locations within the archaeological park. Flash flooding damaged several tombs and washed away portions of the tourist path. When site managers conducted their post-storm assessment the following morning, they found Helena's tent at the high place completely collapsed. The support poles snapped as if by tremendous force. Her personal belongings were scattered across the sacrificial platform. Her notebooks, soaked but mostly legible, were recovered from beneath the fallen canvas. The digital audio recorder was found still running, its battery nearly depleted. When authorities played back the file, they discovered over 8 hours of recording from the previous night. The first few hours contained sounds consistent with a severe rainstorm: thunder, wind, rain hammering against fabric. Then, at approximately 11:37 post-meridian, Helena's voice appears on the recording. She is not speaking to herself or narrating observations. She is having a conversation, responding to someone, though only her side of the exchange is audible. "Yes, I see it now," she says. "The opening, just as you showed me. It has always been there. We were looking at the surface. You exist in the depth." Norman Nediabal. There is a long pause filled only with storm sounds. Then her voice again, trembling with excitement or fear. The recording quality makes it difficult to determine which. "I am not afraid. I have been preparing for this. You have been preparing me." Another pause, longer this time, nearly 3 minutes of wind and rain. When her voice returns, it sounds distant, as though she has moved away from the recording device. "I understand. The Nabateans were not the first. They only remembered what others forgot. The stone remembers everything." What happens next on the recording has never been satisfactorily explained. At the 4-hour and 16-minute mark, the background storm sounds suddenly cease, not gradually but instantly, as if a switch was thrown. In that abrupt silence, other sounds emerge. Multiple human voices, speaking in overlapping whispers, none of them clearly Helena's, none of them speaking any language the linguistic experts who analyzed the file could identify. This layer of whispering continues for approximately 90 seconds, then stops as suddenly as it began. The storm sounds resume at normal volume. Helena's voice is not heard again. The recording continues until the battery died at 7:41 anti-meridium, capturing nothing but wind and rain. Extensive searches of the high place and surrounding areas found no trace of Helena. No body, no clothing, no equipment beyond what was recovered at the tent site. The Jordanian authorities investigated thoroughly, considering possibilities from accidental death by falling or drowning to voluntary disappearance. Volunteers searched every accessible chamber, every carved facade, every ancient cistern. Search dogs found no scent trail beyond the sacrificial platform. Helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the surrounding desert. International missing persons alerts were issued. Dr. Helena Weiss had vanished as completely as if the rock had opened and swallowed her whole. The Sikh of Petra has stood as a silent sentinel for over 2,000 years, its narrow sandstone walls rising more than 80 meters high in places, its serpentine passage stretching 1.2 kilometers from the outside world to the ancient city carved in rose-red stone. But silence, as dozens of tourists discovered between 2018 and 2023, is not always what it seems within these compressed walls of stone. During rainstorms, when the site officially closes and the last visitors are ushered out for their safety, something else fills the vacuum left by human presence. Something that speaks, walks, and moves through the canyon with purpose that defies every rational explanation. The acoustic properties of the Siki have fascinated archaeologists and engineers for decades. The canyon's walls, narrowing in places to less than 3 meters wide while soaring overhead, create what scientists describe as a natural waveguide. Sound doesn't just echo here, it transforms. It bends and amplifies, traveling distances that should be impossible, changing pitch and timbre as it bounces between the ancient stone faces. Engineers from the University of Cincinnati conducted extensive studies in 2016, mapping how the slightest whisper at one end of the canyon could be heard clearly at the other, how the narrow passage creates standing waves that can make a single voice sound like a choir. Rain intensifies these effects exponentially. Water changes the density of the air, adds its own percussion to the stone, creates temporary acoustic channels that wouldn't exist in dry conditions. These are the facts. These are the rational explanations that should account for what tourists have been hearing. But they don't account for the voices. Sarah Mitchell was 28 years old when she visited Petra in April of 2019. She had planned the trip for years, saved meticulously, studied the history until she could recite the names of Nabatean kings like a liturgy. She arrived during the shoulder season, hoping to avoid crowds, and found herself among the last group being evacuated when a spring storm rolled in from the Jordanian desert with unexpected fury. The site guards were hurrying everyone out, their urgency bordering on panic, though the rain had only just begun to fall. Sarah lingered, wanting one last photograph, and that's when she heard it. A conversation in a language she didn't recognize, clear as daylight, coming from somewhere deeper in the canyon. Not echoes of her own group, who were all ahead of her moving toward the exit. Not the guards, who spoke Arabic and English. Something else entirely. The voices were discussing something with urgency, words rising and falling in patterns that felt grammatical, structured, intentional. She recorded 15 seconds on her phone before a guard physically took her arm and pulled her toward the exit, his face pale, his eyes refusing to meet hers when she asked who else was still in the canyon. That recording, which Sarah later uploaded to a travel forum seeking translations, caught the attention of Dr. Marcus Webb, a linguist specializing in Dead Semitic languages at the University of Oxford. What he heard in those 15 seconds, beneath the rain and the stone-filtered echoes, made him request the original file directly from Sarah's phone. The words, he stated in a written analysis that he later tried unsuccessfully to retract, bore striking similarities to ancient Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Middle East during the Nabatean period. But not quite. The phonemes were close, but not exact. Some of the sounds, he noted, didn't correspond to any known language in his database. When pressed, Dr. Webb would only say that either the recording was an elaborate hoax, or something in that canyon was speaking a dialect that shouldn't exist anymore, that perhaps never existed at all. Sarah's experience was not unique. Between 2018 and 2023, at least 17 separate tourist accounts documented similar phenomena. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Rain begins to fall. Site guards immediately start evacuation procedures, often before the storm becomes severe enough to justify such urgency. Tourists lingering near the rear of evacuation groups hear footsteps behind them, pacing them, matching their rhythm. They hear music, sometimes described as flute-like, sometimes as singing, always distant but distinct. They hear conversations, arguments, laughter. They hear the sounds of a place that is occupied when the guards confirm that the sick is empty. But the incident that transformed these scattered reports from curious anomalies into something far more disturbing occurred in October of 2021, when 4 British tourists captured something on video that still defies explanation. James Hartley, Rachel Kensington, Michael Torres, and Sophie Chen were university friends taking a post-graduation trip through the Middle East. All 4 were in their early 20s, tech-savvy, skeptical by nature. They'd read about the strange reports from Petra online and joked about them, the way young people joke about things that secretly unnerve them. They arrived at the site on a clear morning, But by afternoon, clouds had materialized from nowhere, the sky turning the color of old bruises. The evacuation order came swiftly. Unlike previous tourists, however, this group had come prepared. James had mounted a high-resolution action camera to his chest, the kind that captures wide angles in 4K clarity. He'd been filming the entire visit, and he left it running as they followed the press of tourists back through the sea. The footage begins unremarkably enough. The stone walls dripping with the first rainfall. The murmur of disappointed tourists. The stern voices of guards urging everyone to move faster. Then, at timestamp 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Rachel stops walking. The others pause with her. The audio captures her voice clearly, asking if anyone else hears that. "Hears what?" Michael asks. "That," Rachel says. "Listen." And in the silence that follows as the group strains to hear, the camera microphone picks up what their discussion had momentarily obscured. Footsteps. Dozens of them. The unmistakable sound of a crowd moving through the canyon, but moving against the flow of evacuation. Moving deeper into the sea, not out of it. James turns and the camera pans back the way they'd come. The canyon behind them appears empty. Just wet stone, and falling rain, and the narrowing walls disappearing into shadow. But the footsteps continue, growing closer. Then, the voices begin. Multiple voices, overlapping, speaking in that same linguistic twilight that Sarah Mitchell had recorded 2 years earlier. The four friends stand frozen, the camera capturing their breathing, their confused exchanges. Sophie takes out her own phone and begins filming. Now there are 2 cameras capturing the same scene from slightly different angles. At timestamp 5 minutes and 12 seconds, something appears in Sophie's footage that isn't visible in James's. Or rather, it wasn't visible to any of them standing there in the moment, but the camera sensor captured it anyway. A figure, human-shaped but indistinct, moving along the left wall of the canyon. Then another on the right. Then more, dozens more. A procession of shadow forms that seemed to emerge from the stone itself, moving with purpose deeper into the sea. The friends saw nothing with their own eyes. James's camera, pointed in the same direction, shows only empty canyon. But Sophie's phone, using a different sensor, a different spectrum of light sensitivity, captured them clearly. The group fled. The footage becomes chaotic, bouncing perspectives as they run. But in the final seconds before James reaches the exit and the recording cuts off, the camera catches one more thing. One of the shadow figures has turned to face them. It's standing motionless in the center of the canyon, and despite having no discernible features, despite being nothing more than a darkness shaped vaguely like a person, every one of them swears they felt it looking directly at them, watching them go, waiting for them to leave so it could continue its impossible journey. The footage reached the internet within days. Skeptics immediately claimed digital artifacts, camera glitches, the natural play of light and shadow in rain-slicked stone. But experts in digital imaging found no evidence of manipulation. The file's metadata was clean. Frame-by-frame analysis showed the figures moving with consistent physics, interacting with the environment in ways that random noise wouldn't replicate. The shadows fell correctly. The proportions remained constant. Most disturbingly, audio analysis of the voices captured during those 5 minutes revealed layers that shouldn't exist. Beneath the primary conversation, there were others. Dozens of others. A palimpsest of sound, as if hundreds of conversations from hundreds of different time periods were all occurring simultaneously in that space, and the microphone was capturing them all at once. 3 linguistic experts analyzed the clearest voice samples. Dr. Webb, despite his earlier reluctance, was among them. Their joint report identified phonemes from ancient Aramaic, yes, but also from Nabatean Arabic, from languages that predated both, and from sounds that corresponded to no human language in any historical record. One phrase, repeated 3 times in the recording, was eventually translated by Dr. Webb as something approximating the stone remembers in an archaic Aramaic dialect. But the translation was uncertain. The grammar was wrong. The pronunciation was off. It was as if someone who had never been human was trying to speak a human language, getting close but not quite succeeding. The 4 tourists requested anonymity for months, but eventually agreed to limited interviews. What struck investigators most was not their fear, though that was evident, but their certainty. These were not people embellishing a story for attention. They were people fundamentally shaken by an experience that violated their understanding of reality. Michael Torres, the most scientifically minded of the group, stated flatly that he no longer believed in definitive explanations for anything. Sophie Chen stopped traveling entirely for over a year. Rachel Kensington reported nightmares where she walked through the Sikh forever, following voices she could never quite reach, while shadows watched from walls that went up and up into infinite darkness. The site guards, when pressed about their urgent evacuation procedures during rain, offer little explanation. Some cite flash flood risks, which are legitimate concerns in desert canyons, but others, particularly those who've worked at Petra for decades, admit to different motivations. There's a phrase in Arabic they use, roughly translating to "when the sky cries, the old ones walk." They've heard the footsteps too. They've heard the voices. Some claim to have seen the shadows even without cameras, visible in peripheral vision, but vanishing when looked at directly. One guard, who spoke on condition of anonymity, described finding wet footprints in the Sikh after a storm, leading deeper into the canyon, when he knew with absolute certainty that every tourist had been evacuated hours before. The footprints were bare. They were small, like a child's. They went on for 30 meters, and then simply stopped, as if whoever made them had stepped off the ground and into the air. No guard will patrol the Sikh alone during storms anymore. This is unofficial policy, never written down, but universally understood. Those who've tried report, feeling watched, followed, surrounded by presence that presses in from all sides. The canyon, they say, is never truly empty. It's filled with something. Memories, maybe. Echoes of the thousands who walked this passage over millennia. Or something else. Something that wakes when water touches stone and tourists flee and silence reclaims its ancient territory. The rational explanations remain available for those who need them. The acoustic properties of narrow canyons. Pareidolia, the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. Equipment malfunctions. Lens flares. Confirmation bias. But these explanations require ignoring the consistency of reports across years and cultures and camera types. They require dismissing linguistic analysis from multiple experts. They require believing that dozens of tourists, independently, all experienced identical delusions under similar conditions. The Sikh keeps its secrets behind walls of stone that have witnessed empires rise and fall. Perhaps the shadows are exactly what they appear to be, remnants of those who walked this path when Petra was alive, when thousands traveled this canyon daily with goods and prayers and stories. Perhaps some essential quality of those passages imprinted on the stone itself, the way trauma imprints on memory, the way history echoes in places soaked with human presence. Or perhaps the canyon is a threshold, a thin place where past and present occupy the same space, separated only by perception, and rain somehow washes away that separation for brief moments. The footage exists. The audio exists. The testimonies accumulate year after year. And in Petra, when clouds gather and rain begins to fall, the evacuation orders come swift and absolute, and the guards look nervous in ways that flash floods alone cannot explain. The rain began without warning on the 7th of March, 2019, as archaeological linguist Dr. Sarah Mahmood pressed her gloved fingers against the weathered sandstone inside Petra's treasury. For months, she had been documenting a series of previously overlooked inscriptions carved into the interior chambers, markings that generations of tourists had walked past without realizing their significance. But as the first drops of that spring storm darkened the rose-red stone, the ancient Nabatean script seemed to shift before her eyes, the water filling each carved line with shadow, transforming barely visible symbols into legible warnings that had remained hidden for nearly 2,000 years. What Dr. Mahmood read in those newly revealed passages would challenge everything scholars understood about the hydraulic brilliance of Petra, and it would suggest purposes far more unsettling than simple water management. The inscriptions spoke of ceremonies conducted specifically during rainfall, rituals designed to appease entities the Nabateans called the guardians of the threshold. These were not the familiar gods of the Nabatean pantheon that historians had catalogued for decades. These guardians were something else entirely, beings that the ancient texts described as dwelling between the worlds of stone and sky, creatures that awakened when water touched the sacred rocks of Al-Khasneh. The translation that emerged from Dr. Mahmoud's painstaking work revealed a complex theology of storm worship that had somehow escaped scholarly attention despite over a century of archaeological investigation at Petra. The inscriptions detailed specific offerings that had to be made when rain fell upon the treasury, elaborate ceremonies involving incense burned from desert plants, precious oils poured into carefully positioned receptacles carved into the stone floor, and chants that had to be maintained for the entire duration of the storm. The texts were explicit in their warnings about what would happen if these rituals were neglected during rainfall. Failure to honor the Djinn, as the inscriptions termed these guardians, would result in the entities claiming human souls as payment for the insult. One passage, translated from a panel hidden behind centuries of mineral deposits in the Treasury's inner sanctum, reads with chilling specificity, "When the stones weep with heaven's tears, no mortal shall close their eyes in slumber. For the guardians walk the wet pathways and hunger for the breath of the sleeping. The threshold opens when water flows, and those who dream while channels run shall wake in the realm beyond stone, if they wake at all." Yeah. This warning against sleeping while it rained, phrased poetically as "sleeping while the stones weep," appeared in no fewer than 7 separate inscriptions discovered within the Treasury complex. Dr. Mahmoud's findings, published in the Journal of Nabatean Studies in late 2019, sent ripples through the archaeological community. But it was the work of hydraulic archaeologist Dr. James Chen that truly elevated these discoveries from historical curiosities to something far more disturbing. Dr. Chen had spent 5 years mapping the water management systems of Petra, documenting the remarkable network of channels, cisterns, and ceramic pipe systems that allowed the Nabateans to flourish in one of the world's most arid environments. His detailed surveys had revealed engineering sophistication that rivaled Roman aqueducts, with water channeling systems so precise they could redirect flash flood waters from the Sikh Gorge into controlled storage facilities throughout the city. What he could not explain, however, were the numerous architectural anomalies within the system, features that served no apparent practical purpose for water collection or distribution. Channels that led nowhere, carved with extraordinary effort into solid rock, but ending abruptly at blank walls. Cisterns positioned in locations where water could never naturally accumulate, yet carved to the same exacting standards as functional reservoirs. Most puzzling were the elaborate series of small channels, barely wider than a man's hand, that wove throughout the Treasury's foundation in patterns that defied hydraulic logic. These narrow waterways split and rejoined, created loops and spirals, and incorporated carved symbols at junction points that resembled nothing in the Nabatean architectural vocabulary. When Dr. Chen compared his hydraulic maps with the locations of Dr. Mahmoud's newly translated inscriptions, a pattern emerged that challenged both of their understanding of ancient Petra. Every single inscription about the guardians of the threshold corresponded exactly with what Chen had classified as anomalous, non-functional water features. The channels that led nowhere all terminated at walls, bearing warnings about the Djinn. The inexplicable cisterns sat directly beneath carved invocations for protection during storms. And those strange narrow channels with their spiraling patterns matched, symbol for symbol, with inscriptions describing pathways for entities to travel when summoned by rainfall. The controversial theory that emerged from this collaboration suggested something that made traditional archaeologists deeply uncomfortable. What if Petra's legendary hydraulic system served dual purposes? What if the practical water management features that scholars had long admired were built in tandem with an entirely separate ritual system, one designed not to collect water for human use, but to channel it in ways that would satisfy supernatural guardians? The hypothesis proposed that the Nabateans had constructed what amounted to ceremonial pathways for Djinn, elaborate stone mazes that would guide these entities through the city during rainstorms in prescribed patterns that kept them away from sleeping humans and sacred spaces. This interpretation would explain the otherwise inexplicable effort the Nabateans invested in carving channels that served no practical function. It would account for the ritual warnings about sleeping during rain. And it would suggest that the ancient inhabitants of Petra lived in genuine fear of entities they believed awakened when water touched stone, entities powerful enough to demand architectural accommodations on a massive scale. Additional inscriptions documented specific rain ceremonies conducted at the Treasury, rituals that paint a vivid picture of ancient Petra during storms. According to the texts, when rain began to fall, designated priest guardians would immediately begin a ceremony that could not cease until the last drop of water had drained from the sacred channels. These rituals required participants to remain awake and vigilant, chanting protective verses while burning offerings in bronze braziers positioned at specific points throughout the Treasury. The inscriptions described the smoke from these offerings as creating a barrier that the Djinn could not cross, protecting those who performed the ceremony from spiritual predation. One particularly detailed account describes an incident when a ceremony was interrupted by human error. A young acolyte fell asleep during his watch while rain still flowed through the ritual channels. The inscription states that he was found the following morning, physically unharmed but utterly changed, speaking in languages no one recognized and showing no recognition of his own family. Within 7 days, according to the text, he had simply ceased breathing, dying without apparent cause, while staring fixedly at the stone ceiling of his chamber. The inscription uses this tragedy as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the absolute necessity of maintaining vigilance during rainfall. Modern researchers have noted with considerable unease how these ancient warnings align with contemporary experiences at Petra. Local Bedouin guides have long maintained that the Treasury becomes dangerous during rain, and several have stories passed down through generations about tourists or archaeologists who fell asleep in the structure during storms and experienced profound psychological disturbances afterward. While these modern accounts cannot be verified through conventional means, the consistency between ancient warnings and current folklore is striking enough to warrant attention. In 2021, a security guard stationed at Petra reported an incident that eerily echoed the ancient texts. During a rare winter storm, he had taken shelter inside the Treasury and, exhausted from his overnight shift, had briefly dozed off while rain continued to fall. He claimed to have awakened to find water flowing through channels carved into the floor, channels that he insisted had never been visible before, and which were no longer apparent when archaeologists investigated the following day. More disturbing, he reported seeing figures moving through the Treasury's columns, human-shaped but composed of what he described as flowing stone, entities that seemed to be following the water's path through those invisible channels. The hydraulic mystery deepens when you consider the sheer scale of Petra's water systems and the proportion that appears to serve no practical purpose. Dr. Chen's final analysis suggested that nearly 30% of the carved water features at the city's central monuments could not be explained through conventional hydraulic engineering. These anomalous channels consumed enormous labor to create, required maintenance to keep clear, and yet contributed nothing to water storage or distribution. Unless, as the controversial theory suggests, they were never meant for human use at all. The inscriptions make repeated reference to offerings that must be made during storms, and archaeological evidence supports the practice of ritual burning at specific locations throughout the Treasury. Residue analysis from several of the carved offering bowls revealed repeated burning of frankincense, myrrh, and several desert plants known to produce intensely aromatic smoke when burned. Chemical analysis dated this residue across a span of several centuries, suggesting these ceremonies were not occasional events, but regular practices maintained throughout Nabatean occupation of Petra. What remains most unsettling is the precision with which the ancient warnings about sleeping during rain match modern reports of disturbances at the Treasury. Documentation from site security logs shows that incidents of tourists or staff experiencing nightmares, disorientation, or unexplained anxiety cluster overwhelmingly during and immediately after rainfall. While skeptics attribute this pattern to psychological suggestion or the dramatic acoustic effects of water in the Siki Gorge, the correlation is statistically significant enough that site managers now discourage extended stays inside the Treasury during storms, though they cite safety concerns about flash flooding rather than mentioning the archaeological find. The guardians of the threshold, as described in these 2,000-year-old inscriptions, seem to have been viewed by the Nabateans not as malevolent spirits, but as dangerous natural forces that required proper management, much like the flash floods themselves. The rituals were not performed to banish these entities, but to guide and appease them, acknowledging their presence while creating boundaries that kept human and Djinn realms separate. Rain, in this theology, represented a thinning of those boundaries, a time when the barriers between worlds became permeable and vigilance became essential for survival. As research continues, the implications of these discoveries extend beyond archaeology into questions about the relationship between ancient belief systems and the structures people built to accommodate them. Petra stands as a monument, not just to Byzantine engineering brilliance, but potentially to their spiritual cosmology. A city designed to exist in harmony with forces they could neither control nor ignore. And when the rains come to that desert city, when water once again flows through channels carved 2 millennia ago, perhaps those ancient warnings deserve more consideration than modern skepticism typically allows. The rain came to Petra on the night of January 18, 2023, not as the gentle mist that occasionally graces Jordan's high desert, but as a deluge so rare that the oldest Bedouin guides would later say they had seen its like only twice in their lifetimes. For the 7 people huddled illegally inside the ancient city that night, wrapped in sleeping bags and waterproof tarps near the base of the Treasury, the storm was supposed to be an adventure, something to add excitement to their unauthorized overnight stay in one of the world's most mysterious archaeological sites. What they experienced instead would shatter their understanding of reality and leave one of them fundamentally, permanently changed. The group had entered through a route known only to certain local guides, paying a substantial bribe to ensure their passage would go unreported. There was Sarah Chen, a 29-year-old software engineer from Vancouver who had saved for 3 years to make this trip. Marcus Tolliver, a British documentary photographer who had spent the last decade capturing images of abandoned places. The Bergstrom sisters from Sweden, Linnea and Astrid, both archaeology graduate students who wanted to experience the site without the crowds. Jamal Rashid, a Jordanian-American history teacher from Detroit. And finally, Tom Brennan and his girlfriend, Zoe Martinez, travel bloggers who specialized in extreme adventure content. 7 people who thought they were simply breaking park rules to spend a night beneath the stars in one of humanity's greatest monuments. 7 people who had no idea they were about to become witnesses to something that would defy every rational explanation. According to their testimony, which was given separately to park authorities, Jordanian police, and later to several researchers, the evening began without incident. They had set up their camp around 8:30 in the evening, positioning themselves against the Treasury's western wall, where the massive facade could provide some shelter from the intensifying wind. The rain began around 10:15, heavy and cold, driven sideways by gusts that howled through the narrow canyon approaches. They retreated deeper under their tarps, using the limited overhang of the carved stone to stay dry. Several of them dozed. Sarah Chen later told investigators that she remembered checking her phone at 11:43 and seeing she still had 78% battery life. She had been texting her sister in Canada, describing the storm's intensity. Everything was normal. Everything was explicable. The change began at 2:47 in the morning. All 7 witnesses agreed on this precise time because several of them were awake and had been checking their phones. Marcus Tolliver had been attempting to capture long exposure photographs of lightning illuminating the Treasury. Zoe Martinez was recording video for their travel blog. Jamal Rashid couldn't sleep and had been reading an ebook on his tablet. Then, in an instant that all of them described as physically tangible, as if the air itself had suddenly thickened, every electronic device in their possession died simultaneously. Not gradually, not one by one, but in the same moment, as if a switch had been thrown. Phones went black. Camera batteries that had been fully charged showed no power. Marcus's backup batteries, still in their sealed packages, were tested later and found to be completely drained. Zoe's power bank, which had been at 94% capacity, according to her last check 3 minutes earlier, was dead. Even Tom Brennan's mechanical wristwatch, which required no battery, had stopped at exactly 2:47. The darkness that followed was absolute. The storm clouds blocked any moonlight or starlight. Their flashlights, which should have worked independently of the phone batteries, produced nothing. For perhaps 30 seconds, according to their accounts, the only illumination came from the lightning that continued to flash across the sky, briefly revealing the Treasury's facade in stark, flickering snapshots. Then they saw the lights. Astrid Bergstrom later told investigators that they appeared first as a faint blue-green glow emanating from deep within the carved stone itself, as if the rock had become translucent and something luminous existed just beneath its surface. The glow intensified rapidly, spreading across the entire facade of the Treasury like bioluminescence spreading through water. Within moments, the massive structure was radiating enough light to see by. A cold, otherworldly illumination that threw no shadows and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The rain continued to pour down, but in the strange light, the drops appeared suspended, moving in slow motion, each one a tiny prism refracting that impossible blue-green radiance. Then the figures emerged. All 7 witnesses reported seeing them, though their descriptions varied in specific details. Sarah Chen described them as humanoid but elongated, their proportions subtly wrong, moving with a fluid grace that seemed independent of gravity. Marcus Tolliver said they appeared to be made of the same light that illuminated the facade, as if they were concentrations of that radiance taking roughly human form. Linnea Bergstrom insisted they wore robes or cloaks that seemed to be woven from stone itself, flexible rock that moved like fabric. What everyone agreed upon was that there were multiple figures, at least 5, possibly as many as 10, and that they emerged directly from the carved surface of the Treasury, passing through solid rock as if it were nothing more than smoke. Tom Brennan attempted to reboot his phone, an action he repeated compulsively according to the others, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the device twice. Zoe Martinez began to pray in Spanish, words from childhood that she hadn't spoken in years tumbling from her lips. Jamal Rashid tried to wake the others, shaking Tom and yelling that they needed to run. But 3 members of the group seemed unable to move. Marcus Tolliver later described feeling paralyzed, conscious and aware but unable to make his muscles respond to his commands. The Bergstrom sisters reported the same phenomenon, as if they were being held in place by invisible restraints. The sound began shortly after the figures appeared. It was captured, partially, on Marcus Tolliver's camera, which, although its battery was dead and its screen dark, was later discovered to have continued recording to its internal memory. The audio file, which has been analyzed by sound engineers and linguists, contains several layers of sound. There is the steady roar of the rain and wind. There is the panicked breathing of the witnesses and their scattered, frightened exclamations. But beneath and around these identifiable sounds is something else. A whispering, multi-voiced and rhythmic, speaking in no language that linguists have been able to identify. Some researchers have suggested it might be an extremely corrupted form of Napatayan, the language spoken by Petra's ancient builders. Others believe it's something older, pre-linguistic, a pattern of sounds that might trigger something primal in human consciousness. One audio analyst noted that the frequencies present in the whispers correspond closely to those that naturally occur in certain types of sedimentary rock when subjected to pressure, a phenomenon known as rock resonance. Whether this is significant remains unclear. Interspersed with the whispers was another sound that all witnesses mentioned in their testimony. A grinding, scraping noise like stone moving against stone, slow and deliberate. Marcus's audio recording captured this clearly. Tom Brennan, in his statement, said it sounded like the carved faces on the Treasury were turning to look at them. Stone eyelids scraping open, stone lips parting. Zoe Martinez reported that she saw this happen, that the massive carved urns and figures on the facade actually moved, animated by some impossible force. Jamal Rashid disputed this, saying he saw the facade clearly and nothing moved, but the sound of movement was undeniable. Then Sarah Chen stood up. Multiple witnesses reported this with consistent details. She rose smoothly from where she'd been sitting, her movements calm and purposeful, entirely at odds with the panic surrounding her. She walked toward the luminous figures with steady steps, rain plastering her hair to her face, her eyes open but unfocused. Tom Brennan grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back, but she shrugged him off with surprising strength. Jamal Rashid stepped in front of her, trying to block her path, but she walked around him as if he weren't there. The paralysis that had held Marcus and the Bergstrom sisters broke suddenly, and all 3 scrambled to their feet. What happened next occurred in less than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds fractured the group completely. Marcus Tolliver ran die. He would later express deep shame about this, but in that moment, watching Sarah approach the glowing figures, Something in his mind simply broke, and his body made the decision to flee. Linnea Bergstrom followed immediately, grabbing her sister's hand and pulling her along. The three of them ran back toward the Seek, the narrow canyon entrance to Petra, splashing through rapidly forming puddles, stumbling in the darkness that closed around them as soon as they moved away from the Treasury's unnatural light. Behind them they heard shouting. Tom Brennan calling Sarah's name. Zoe screaming for everyone to run. Jamal yelling something about getting help. The three who fled navigated the Seek by feel more than sight, hands on the rough stone walls, feet finding the ancient paved path by memory and luck. The rain was blinding. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it felt physical. Marcus slipped and fell twice, badly scraping his hand. When they finally emerged from the canyon and reached the modern visitor center, they pounded on doors until a security guard responded. The time was 3:21 in the morning. 34 minutes had passed since their devices had died. A security team accompanied them back into Petra, lights and radios in hand. They found Tom, Zoe, and Jamal huddled together near the Treasury, soaked and shivering, their eyes wide with shock. The strange light was gone. The Treasury was just stone again, cold and dark and silent. Sarah Chen had vanished. Tom's account, given in a voice that kept breaking, described watching her walk directly toward the largest of the luminous figures. She had reached out her hand, he said, and the figure had mirrored the gesture. When their fingers touched, Sarah's entire body had become luminous, glowing with that same blue-green radiance. Then she had stepped forward, directly into the stone facade of the Treasury, and the rock had accepted her like water accepting a stone. She had disappeared into solid rock, and the light had gone with her. The search began immediately. Petra security forces, reinforced by local police and eventually by Jordanian military personnel, conducted a systematic sweep of the entire archaeological park. They checked every tomb, every cave, every possible hiding place. They brought in dogs. They used thermal imaging cameras. Sarah Chen's photograph was distributed to every hotel, hostel, and transportation hub in southern Jordan. The other 6 members of the group were questioned extensively, their stories checked and cross-referenced. The physical evidence was limited, but disturbing. The electronic devices were examined by technicians in Amman and found to have sustained no physical damage, yet none would function until their batteries were completely replaced. The audio file from Marcus's camera was genuine and unmanipulated. Analysis of the site revealed unusual electromagnetic readings near the Treasury's facade, fluctuations that persisted for nearly 48 hours after the incident. Sarah Chen was found 3 days later, on January 21st, at the monastery, another major monument in Petra, located approximately 5 kilometers from the Treasury, requiring a climb of over 800 rock-cut steps to reach. A group of morning tourists discovered her sitting calmly on the ancient steps, wearing the same clothes she had disappeared in, seemingly unharmed. She was immediately taken to a hospital in Wadi Musa, the town adjacent to Petra, where she underwent comprehensive medical evaluation. The medical findings were deeply anomalous. Sarah showed no signs of dehydration despite 3 days without documented water intake. Her body temperature was slightly elevated at 99.2 degrees, but not enough to indicate fever. Blood tests revealed unusual mineral content, specifically elevated levels of silica and trace amounts of elements typically found in sandstone composition. A neurological examination showed heightened activity in her temporal lobes, regions associated with memory and auditory processing, but no signs of injury or disease. Most puzzling was the presence of fine stone dust in her lungs and sinuses, particles consistent with Petra's rose-red sandstone, as if she had been breathing powdered rock. Psychologically, Sarah presented a complex picture. She had no memory of the 3-day period between her disappearance and her discovery. None at all. The last thing she clearly remembered was setting up camp that evening. Everything after was blank, a void in her consciousness. Yet during her psychiatric evaluation, she spontaneously began speaking in what linguists later identified as fragments of 3 different ancient Semitic languages, Nabatean phrases, Akkadian words, even a few sentences in what might have been Aramaic. Sarah had no prior knowledge of these languages. Her educational background was in computer science. She had never studied ancient Near Eastern languages or archaeology. The statement she made, repeated several times during her initial evaluation and recorded by hospital staff, has become the most frequently quoted element of the entire incident. Sitting in her hospital bed, looking directly at the psychiatrist but somehow past her, Sarah spoke in a voice that those present described as eerily calm, almost dreamy. She said, quote, "They showed me the city beneath the city, where it always rains," end quote. When pressed for elaboration, she added that the rain there wasn't water but light, and that the light remembered everything, every person who had ever walked through Petra's streets, every word ever spoken in its tombs. She said the Nabateans hadn't built Petra. They had discovered it, already ancient, already watching. She said the carved faces weren't decorations. They were windows. Then she stopped talking about it entirely. As suddenly as the words had come, they ceased. She became visibly distressed when questioned further, experiencing what appeared to be panic attacks when shown photographs of the Treasury, or asked about the glowing figures. The psychiatric evaluation diagnosed acute dissociative amnesia with features of post-traumatic stress disorder, but several of the examining physicians privately expressed uncertainty about this diagnosis. The case simply didn't fit known patterns. Sarah Chen returned to Canada 4 weeks later, accompanied by her sister. She declined all media interviews and requests from researchers. The other 6 witnesses gave statements but also withdrew from public discussion. The Jordanian authorities conducted an official investigation, producing a report that acknowledged the witnesses' testimonies, but offered no conclusions about what had actually occurred. The unusual electromagnetic readings were noted, but not explained. The audio recording was authenticated, but not interpreted. The case remains officially unexplained. Researchers who have studied the incident note several elements that separate it from typical alleged paranormal encounters. The presence of multiple witnesses whose accounts, while varying in subjective interpretation, align on key fact. The physical evidence, limited but measurable. The medical anomalies documented in Sarah's examination. The audio recording, which whatever its ultimate explanation, captures sounds that have no easy conventional interpretation. And perhaps most significantly, the technological failures affecting multiple devices simultaneously, a detail that appears in numerous reports from the area, but rarely with this many corroborating witnesses. What happened at Petra that stormy January night remains, in every technical sense, unexplained. 7 people entered the ancient city seeking adventure. 6 left traumatized, and 1 disappeared into stone itself, only to return days later, fundamentally changed, speaking impossible languages, about impossible visions. The rain at Petra is rare, but it comes still. And when it does, the guards who patrol at night report that they stay away from the Treasury until dawn breaks, and whatever watches from within the carved stone returns to its long, patient sleep. The rain comes to Petra differently than it comes to other places. It arrives without warning, sudden and fierce, transforming the rose-red city from a sun-baked marvel into something else entirely. And it is during these moments, when water streams down the ancient facades and pools in the Sikh's narrow channel, that the Djinn appear. This pattern, documented now across decades of sporadic reports, remains the most consistent element of the phenomenon. Every authenticated sighting, every recording, every disappearance has occurred during rainfall. Not in the golden afternoon light when thousands of tourists fill the Treasury's courtyard. Not during the clear desert nights when the stars illuminate the carved tombs. Only when the sky opens and the rains begin. Why? The question hangs in the air like the petrichor that rises from Petra's sandstone. Meteorologists have confirmed nothing unusual about the precipitation itself. The rain that falls here is chemically identical to rain anywhere else in Jordan. Geologists have examined how water interacts with the carved facades, searching for some optical phenomenon that might explain the shadowy figures witnesses describe. They have found nothing conclusive. The stone absorbs water, as stone does. Light refracts as physics predicts. Yet, the encounters continue. Acoustic experts brought sophisticated equipment to analyze the recordings captured by Dr. Helena Weiss and others before him. The sounds preserved on those digital files, those voices speaking in no known language, were subjected to spectral analysis, phonetic breakdown, and comparison against every linguistic database available. The experts confirmed that the recordings are genuine, not fabricated or altered. They confirmed that the sounds are indeed vocal, produced by what appears to be human or humanoid vocal anatomy. But they cannot identify the language. They cannot even agree on whether it is language at all, or something else, some form of communication that predates language as we understand it. One linguist who examined the Weiss recordings, speaking on condition of anonymity, said the vocalizations reminded her of something she encountered once before. Years earlier, she had analyzed recordings of a coma patient who spoke continuously for 3 days in what sounded like coherent speech, but matched no language on Earth. The patient died without regaining consciousness. The comparison is unsettling. Are the voices at Petra communicating, or are they echoing something, repeating patterns imprinted in the stones themselves? Then there is the matter of Dr. Heinrich Weiss himself. The German archaeologist was last seen on the evening of March 23, 2007, entering the sick just as rain began to fall. His colleagues at the site, sheltering in the modern facilities near the entrance, assumed he had returned to his accommodation. When he failed to appear the next morning, a search was launched. They found his recording equipment in the Treasury's courtyard, still running, its memory card filled with 8 hours of audio. Most of it was the sound of rain. But in the final 17 minutes, those voices emerged, speaking in their unknown tongue, growing louder and closer to the microphone. And then, silence. Not even the sound of rain. Just silence, as if the device had been moved somewhere where sound itself could not reach. Dr. Weiss has never been found. Jordanian authorities conducted an extensive search. International teams assisted. Every canyon, every tomb, every carved chamber was examined. The desert beyond Petra was surveyed from the air and on the ground. No trace of him was discovered. No body, no clothing, no personal effects beyond the recording equipment in the Treasury's courtyard. His disappearance is not unique. It is simply the most thoroughly documented. Sarah Chen's case is different, and perhaps more disturbing because she returned. The Malaysian graduate student was reported missing on November 9, 2015, after she failed to meet her research partner following an afternoon of photographing inscriptions in the royal tombs. It had been raining. When she reappeared 3 days later, she was found sitting calmly in the same spot where she had last been seen. Her camera beside her, its battery long dead. She remembered nothing. Medical examinations revealed no signs of physical trauma, no drugs in her system, no evidence of where she had been or what had happened to her. But her camera, when examined, told a fragmentary story. The final photos were time-stamped across the 3 days she was missing. They showed the interior of the tomb, yes, but also other spaces, corridors that don't appear on any map of Petra, chambers carved with symbols that match no known Nabatean design, and in several images, taken at different times across those 72 hours, shadows that suggest figures standing just beyond the frame. Sarah Chen left Jordan shortly after and has refused all requests for interviews. Her research partner, however, noted one detail that he found particularly strange. When Sarah was found, her clothes were completely dry despite the fact that it had rained heavily the night before. More than that, they appeared freshly laundered, as if she had just put them on. The questions multiply faster than answers. Why does rainfall trigger the phenomenon? Some theories suggest water activates something in the stone itself, something the Nabateans understood when they carved their city. Others propose that the atmospheric conditions during storms create ideal circumstances for interdimensional overlap, whatever that might mean. Still others, speaking from religious or folkloric traditions, insist that the Djinn have always been associated with water in this region, that springs and wells and rainfall are the thresholds where their world touches ours. But none of these theories explain the specifics. None account for the missing time, the unidentified languages, the selective nature of the encounters. The Jordanian authorities no longer speak publicly about the phenomena at Petra. Officially, the site is safe, thoroughly patrolled and monitored. Tourism is vital to Jordan's economy, and Petra is its crown jewel. But those who work at the site, the guides and guards and archaeologists, know the unofficial policy. During the rainy season, overnight stays are discouraged. Not forbidden, just discouraged. The patrols that regularly sweep the site during dry months become less frequent when the weather changes. Access to certain areas, particularly the more remote tombs and the high places of sacrifice, becomes mysteriously restricted. It is not fear precisely. It is something closer to respect. An acknowledgement that Petra, for all its status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and tourist destination, is not entirely ours to control. Paranormal investigators have come, of course. They bring their electromagnetic field detectors, their thermal cameras, their spirit boxes, and all the apparatus of modern ghost hunting. Some claim to record anomalies. Others find nothing. None have produced evidence that satisfies scientific scrutiny or adds meaningfully to what is already known. The phenomena at Petra, if they are real, operate according to rules we do not yet understand, using mechanisms our instruments cannot measure. What remains is the pattern. Rain falls. Tourists leave. The ancient city empties, and in that emptiness, something moves. Guides who have worked at Petra for decades speak carefully about what they know. They will tell you where not to stand when the rain comes. They will explain which tombs seem different, though they struggle to articulate how. They will mention the feeling that sometimes, in certain places, the air grows heavy with attention, as if something vast and patient is watching. And watching is perhaps all it does. For all the recordings and disappearances, for all the missing time and unexplained phenomena, there is little evidence of malicious intent. People are frightened, yes. People vanish sometimes. But in a landscape this vast and ancient, with cliffs and canyons and 1,000 places where a misstep could prove fatal, can we be certain that something supernatural is responsible? Can we distinguish between the genuinely paranormal and the natural dangers of a place like Petra amplified by fear and folklore? We cannot. That is the truth of it. We have questions without answers, evidence without explanation, patterns without meaning we can grasp. Petra receives visitors during sunny days. Thousands of them, filling the sick, photographing the Treasury, marveling at the theater and the royal tombs. They come for history, for beauty, for the wonder of what human hands carved from living rock 2,000 years ago. They leave with their photos and their memories, having encountered nothing more supernatural than the play of light on ancient stone. But when the rains come, and the tourists leave, when the site empties, and the sound of water echoes through carved channels, something ancient still walks those corridors. The guides know it. The authorities acknowledge it in their silence. The stones themselves bear witness. What the Nabataeans knew, what they carved into these cliffs and worshipped in these high places, we have lost. Our modern world, with all its sensors and satellites and scientific instruments, cannot explain what happens when the desert rain falls on Petra's rose-red wall. Perhaps we are not meant to explain it. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to endure, reminding us that the world is stranger and older than our theories allow. Perhaps the Djinn, if that is what they are, exist in the spaces between what we know and what we have forgotten. The stones remember what we've forgotten, and when the rain falls, they whisper it back. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.